Alrighty folks, here we go. We got a bit of a chatty one here. I just want to explain something about wet palettes. Now I have already touched on wet palettes on my basic tools for painting. You can find that video just there. But I want to do this due to a discussion I've had on the Facebook chat room that I have for my Patreons. And the discussion came about to wet palettes, and I figured now would be a good time to kind of show you guys what a wet palette is and how much are they, due to the fact that, you know, when I first started some videos I was doing it with using a regular palette and thinning the paints down and showing you to do that with the very first few videos I did. But then when I start painting some normal models, I prefer to use a wet palette because that's how I paint. But I didn't really come back to wet palettes and really go into detail about the palettes themselves. Alright, so the very first thing I wanted to do was show you a free wet palette, how to make yourself a wet palette for basically nothing, as long as you've got some of the materials available to you. The first things first, the regular takeaway container, something that with a lid, it's tight, it's airtight. Now if you get a Tupperware one with a clip with a little rubber seal around it, that's even better. But essentially, get yourself one of these and you can make yourself a wet palette that's perfectly fine. It doesn't cost you anything if you've got this stuff lying around. Now, in there, place yourself some sponge. You can cut it to size and make it nice and fit nicely, or you can put some kitchen roll in there, or blue roll, or anything. The idea behind it is it's a reservoir for water. You don't just want to sick water in the bottom, because you're going to need to put some paper on top, so you just want something that will hold and maintain its hold on water. Once you've done that, you then add water to it. Now you want to add water to the point where it's reached its saturation point. It's not absolutely dripping, soaking wet. You don't want it full of water, although this is where some experimentation is required. Some people would tell you to, if you're using a sponge, fill it up to the water so the water is a fraction of a millimeter below the top of the sponge. You do need to do a little bit of experimentation when using a wet palette and how you prefer to use it, depending on the climate that you are using and just general your local area, but also depending on your house. Certain houses are drier than others, some are warmer than others, some are colder than others. You might have a draft right where you put your wet palette that will dry it out. These things can affect a wet palette, so you do kind of have to choose and have an experiment. But the idea is you put enough water in there to make it wet, but not to the point where you've got a tub of water sat next to you. Okay, on top of that, what you need to do is put some baking parchment. Again, this is where there's a little bit of an issue, because certainly in the UK I actually personally find it quite difficult to find baking parchment. Now the reason why I'm making a big point about that is you don't want grease-proof paper, because that has a wax on it that's designed to stop the juices of your food from going between the food and whatever you're using. It's a barrier, and that's kind of counterproductive for a wet palette. You want the water to get from the sponge to just kind of capillary up through the paper. So if it's got a wax that's designed to stop that, it's not going to work. So baking parchment, although somehow some people mentioned to me to use tracing paper. Now that kind of worked for me for a little while. Didn't work very well. I wasn't happy with it, but some people just use tracing paper, so it's an idea. And so basically what you do is, once you've wet the reservoir, you then lay the paper on top and make sure it's nice and flat. You keep it lying down. When you wet one side of a piece of paper, it'll curl up. Don't worry about that, it happens. You then just lay it out nice and flat, and so you wait until it's nice and flat, and then that's it. You've got a wet palette. It's as simple as that. Sponge or kitchen roll, water, and then tracing paper or baking parchment, and then that's your wet palette. That's how it works. Okay, once you've got a lid on it, you can open it off, and basically the whole point of a wet palette is it serves two purposes. Number one, it leaves your paint wet for longer. So in other words, when you put a dollop of paint on your wet palette and you don't really use it all because you're painting the eyes of a model and you've put the smallest amount of paint you could possibly get on the palette, but you know, it's still, you're only painting some eyes, your paint stays wet, so that next time you paint some eyes, depending on how long it is, again some experimentation is required, you should be able to just come back and use the paint. It's fine. The other kind of thing that a wet palette does is it thins your paint for you, depending on, and this is again, it's experimentation, and certainly if you experiment with free stuff, then you should be alright. But the idea is, if you getting the balance right between how much water you put in, how dry you leave it, what paper you're using, you get that balance where it just thins the paint enough for you without thinning it too much, and then you get, you know, a nice, it already thins the paint for you, so you don't have to be thinning your paint. So that's a free wet palette, and that's what it's for. It keeps your paint last longer, and it also basically thins the paint for you. Now, why doesn't everybody use a free wet palette? For me, it's because I didn't want to keep experimenting. I'm not very good at experimenting with stuff, and so I was met with failure after failure, and I was done. I didn't want to carry on experimenting, so I went out and I bought one. Now the first one I bought, now I did use it as a spray protector at one point, is this. It is the Frisk acrylic keep wet palette. I think I got it from eBay or I got it from Amazon, I can't remember which, but it was about £12. Okay, I don't know if that included postage or not. I think at the time of buying it, I think I actually paid about £15. Now this, I found one on Amazon, and I'll put a link below. But this is what I used, and inside that, I don't have anything in here because I've used it all up and I bought a new wet palette afterwards. But it's just a welt, and inside this, in the pack that came with the wet palette, it was essentially it was cartridge paper. I don't know why, but it just seemed like it was just a thick stock of paper. It wasn't cards, it was just really thick paper, very porous and fibrous, and that went in there, and then you added water to that, and then over the top of that you just laid a piece of paper. Now we have a look at this. You can see it's kind of this big. It's kind of a little bit longer than a 30cm ruler. I mean, internally the 30cm ruler fits quite snugly in there, and then across it's about 17.5cm. Or for old money, that's about 7 inches across. It's pretty good. It worked for me for how long was I using that for? 6 months, maybe, almost a year, perhaps. Excuse me. And that worked well. I mean, that's perfectly fine. You add water to it, you lay the paper on it, and it's a wet palette. It's fine. One thing I don't like about this thing was it's just vacuum formed plastic. There's no seal to it at all. The water didn't evaporate, not particularly. It did kind of keep stuff wet. It was fine. I mean, it's just I did break Where did it break? I mean, it's covered in micro fractures around the edge. Because it just sits. If I do that, it just sits on there, like that. It's kind of just like a bit of friction pushing it together, and so you keep having to open it. You have to stretch it a little bit and release it, and it's covered in micro fractures where the plastic just gets stretched to the point where it breaks. Yeah, and I broke the corner. Just there, don't you see? Because I just keep doing that. I wasn't happy with that. It still worked even after I'd broken it. It just didn't feel professional enough. It works, but just working wasn't enough for me. I wanted it to feel nice as well as functional. And then I heard about Redgrass Games' Everlasting Wet Palette Kickstarter. Now, I'm not going to go into the downfalls of that particular Kickstarter and things that they promised. I'm just going to talk about the product at the end, okay? Because I am happy with the product at the end. So no matter what they promised at the beginning, what I paid for and what I got, I'm happy with. Which is the Studio XL Everlasting Wet Palette. Now, I do have water in here. Can I tip it? Oh yeah, there we go. It's not too bad. But there we go. So I have the Everlasting Wet Palette. You see, I do use it. It's inside it. It has a medical grade sponge that holds apparently like 4 times its weight in water. And then we have, and this is basically what you're looking for. We've got a sponge at the bottom, and then we have the paper on top, and then we have water that goes in there. This is drying out. It gets quite hot and humid in this room, and I don't refresh it enough as I need to, so it's starting to dry out. That's a paint well, which is nice for putting washers and stuff in it, or glazes and mixing up stuff. If you don't want to put it in here because it's too wet, the paint is too wet. And then this is what I use, and then this has a rubber seal on it. You see that? And then that just fits on here quite nicely on there. You push it and then you burp it, which is by pushing it into the middle. You push the air out, and then as you release the pressure, it then sucks itself up. And there is a strap that goes on it as well, so you can carry it around without it falling open. Some people assume that means that you can walk around with a wet palette that's got paint in it, and I'm not quite sure why people thought that, because it's water and paint, and if you tip it up, the wet paint is going to run everywhere. So I'm not quite sure why people assume that they could carry it around with paint in it. But anyway, the point is it comes with a strap, so that should you choose to take it somewhere, it holds itself together nice and neatly, so that you don't have to go fishing for the lid and the base and the sponge and the paper. Okay, so it's simple as that. Now, the problem with this is it's expensive. It is 49 euros. And I think is the decimal point of a euro a cent? I think it is. So 49 euros and 90 cents for the Studio XL. I'm a commission painter, therefore I wanted the bigger one. They do a smaller one, which is about half the size. If you look at this, this is about an A4 piece of paper. This is the Studio Wet Palette, and you could argue that that's around about the same size. I think the A4 piece of paper is marginally bigger than this wet palette. They do a painter version of this, which is around about half the size, which for most hobbyists is probably about enough, especially if you're only painting one army, maybe two. You'll have enough space to put a few dots of paint for your different palettes. So most of the time you've got, I imagine that most of you will only have, a handful of paints you use. I mean, as a commission painter, I'm using loads and loads of different paints for different types of armies, so I needed the space. But You know, if you've only got 1 or 2 armies and you've only got, you know, 20 paints that you use, I don't know, you know, the painter should be enough. Now the painter size is €36.90. It's only what is it, 13 euros between the two sizes. So you could possibly argue that you could get through both of them. You could get the bigger one, sorry, because it's only 13 euros bigger. It's you know, it's up to you. You know, you can, you know, whatever. But the point is, that's what I use because I wanted it. It looks good. It looks good. You know, I make movies. I make videos, so you know, it looks good for camera as well. It's professional looking. It feels good when I use it, and more importantly for me, I didn't need to experiment with it because it's designed as a wet palette. I don't have to experiment. The sponge, the paper, all I need to do is make sure I put the right amount of water in it. So yeah, I hope this video has been helpful. I'll put all the links to the products below, but overall that's what I know about wet palettes. If you've got any questions or suggestions, or perhaps I haven't really covered this subject very well in this video, then feel free to throw down a comment in the throw down a comment in the comments below. I can't even get my words out tonight. It would be interesting to see if this has been helpful. If you've got any other wet palette ideas, or other, you know, if you want to help people find, you know, just exactly where what brand of baking parchment works and where to get it from, feel free, throw that in the comments below as well, because I couldn't find baking parchment. I'm happy with my everlasting wet palette, but some people might want to go the free route and would rather some help there. So yeah, feel free, have a chat. Let's have a discussion about this in the end. I mean, this subject came up from the my Patreon only chat room, so you know, those guys will probably come and have a chat while in there as well. So, and speaking of Patreon, if you wish, the link is in the description below. If you want to help support the channel and see more videos, feel free to have a look down there. While you're down there, there are links to the products I've mentioned, as well as all my other social media. You can have a peruse around there at your leisure. So that just leaves me to say, yeah, I hope you like it. Like, share and subscribe. If you do, don't forget to press the bell button next to it. And I'll say thank you for watching this one. I'll catch you in the next one. Dara.